Welcome to the Night Club, guys. It's your host, the Night Wrencher. Now, today we're going to be going over the secret to tuning Holley carburetors. Believe it or not, there is a secret to actually get these things dialed in to make them do whatever you want them to do. An example of this is my carbureted LS. This is a 4.8 liter, 293 cubic inches. This thing's putting down over 400 to the rear wheels. It's got a 78, 75 turbo on it. It's got an old school Barry Grant 650 alcohol carburetor. I'm running it on E85 and this thing runs on the street and purrs like a kitten. How many blow through carbureted setups do you know that run on E85 and are daily driven on the street? I bet you can count those on your hands. So you know that if there is a secret to tuning these Holley carburetors, I know what it is and I'm going to share it with you right now. So let's go ahead and jump on the bench and we'll get started. All right, so we're here on the bench. Anybody that knows me knows that I like to make charts. So we're going to go ahead and make a chart basically detailing what you need to do in order to dial in your Holley carburetor perfectly. So just like we have a food pyramid with what we should eat most, what we should eat less, we have a pyramid for Holley carburetors. And the first step to dialing in your carburetor, and this is a no-brainer for everybody, it would be to set your float and fuel pressure. And a lot of people tend to skip the second one. People know how to set their floats. They either take their bowl, flip it upside down, take the seam that's on the float, and then they compare that to the sight plug and they set it that way. Or they actually set it on their car, bring it all the way down, take out the sight plug, and then start bringing it up until it starts to spill over, and then plug it. The fuel pressure is another issue entirely, because if your fuel pressure is 1 pound off, that's going to change the entire fuel curve of your carburetor. If you have a mechanical fuel pump and you don't have a gauge, it could be putting out 7 psi. It could be putting out 6. It could be putting out 3. You just don't know unless you have a gauge on it. You want to make sure that you have at least 6 psi, and if you can't get it to 6, at least 5.5 psi, and no more than 6.5 psi. Maybe 7 if all the seals in your carburetor are good. If not, it's going to blow through the needle and seat. It's going to fill up your carburetor and you're going to have problems. So aim for that 6 to 6.5 psi whenever possible. If you don't have enough fuel pressure, your entire fuel curve is going to be lean and you're going to be chasing jetting, you're going to be chasing IFRs, you're going to be chasing power valve, and the whole problem would stem from the fuel pressure being too low. The next step to do that is you're actually going to go ahead and set your preliminary idle. So what you're going to do there is you're going to set your idle a little bit rich, you're going to set up your idle speed a little bit higher, and what that's going to do, it's going to prevent your car from dying when you get to the stop sign. It's going to prevent your car from dying when you put it in gear, and that's just going to make sure that you can drive it around safely without having any problems. You're going to notice that as you get that tune dialed in, your idle speed is actually going to go up, and then once you get everything dialed in, you have to go ahead and bring that back down. Another part of the preliminary idle is you have to set your timing. And this is another thing that people skip. People will ignore their base timing. They will set up their distributor so that the car starts and they will ignore it for the rest of the life of the car or the motor, or they will never touch it. And when somebody asks them, what's your base timing at? I don't know. What's your max timing at? I don't know. If you don't know where your timing's at, you don't know how much more power you have left in that car, how much more drivability you have left in that carburetor. So you have to make sure you know where your timing is and you know where your total timing is. So if you have less than 15 degrees of base timing at idle, you're losing out. So you want to bring that up to at least 15, 16, 17, 18 degrees. And if you got a bigger cam, you're going to want to be in that 20, 21, 22 degrees. So the next step after that, you're like, okay, so now it's the transition, right? The T-slot, your off-idle performance, and that's actually wrong. You're going to skip over your transition, and the next step is actually to dial in your main jets. The best way to dial in your main jets is go into high gear, cruise at a consistent RPM. You're going to be somewhere around 20% throttle, 15 to 20% throttle. You're going to be off of the T-slot. And the reason you do it in high gear is because your engine is at the highest amount of load that it's normally going to see. And that's where you set your main jets. The reason you set your main jets before you start setting your transition is because your main jets feed the transition. So imagine you dial in the transition, everything's all good to go. Then you jet down the carburetor. Well, now your transition is going to be lean. So you want to start at the main jets, then go back in the transition. So that's where we go back and we do our transition. Longtime viewers of the channel know that I have a whole video series on every single one of these circuits. So when we're talking about the transition of the carburetor, that's fed by your idle feed restrictors, which are here and here. Depending on the carburetor model, sometimes they're up here, but typically they're down here, and that's going to feed your transition circuit. If you get off idle and you're just about 5-10% on throttle and it's hesitating, it's leaning out, your idle feed restrictors are probably too small. For any kind of modified engine with a decent cam, good compression, it's probably going to be too lean. For old school motors that have low compression, don't necessarily have the best cam, your idle feed restrictors might even be too rich. So it all depends on individual builds. And that's why you need to pay attention to the way you set this up. Because as you're moving up in the pyramid, you start to check off things on your list. You're like, I know it's not this, and I know it's not that, and I know it's not that. So you just move up on the list. So that's where your transition comes in. The idle feed restrictors feed your transition, but they also feed your idle circuit. So the next step on top of that is going to be feeding your idle circuit. You guys will notice that we're doing the idle circuit again, but this time we're actually going to dial it in. The reason we have the preliminary first and the idle again second is because the idle circuit is fed by the transition circuit that's fed by the main jet circuit. So if you just set it up willy-nilly down low, by the time you get to the end of it, you're going to be able to really dial it in. So that's when you're going to be able to get it down to like 700 RPMs or 800 RPMs or whatever you want to do. You won't have to worry about if the transitions are right size. You don't have to worry about if the main jets are the right size. Everything is set up already for you. You just need to dial it in. You don't need to touch the timing. You don't need to touch the main jets. You're already good to go. You set the idle speed. You set the idle mixture screws, and you're done. You notice that we haven't touched the power valve and we haven't touched the secondary circuit yet. And that's because for general drivability, those are not important. The way you set up your power valve, and again, I have a video on this, is you figure out what your main jets are supposed to be, and then you find a hill or you try to accelerate or you try to pass a car. A vacuum gauge is really good for this. You find out where your lowest vacuum reading is or your medium vacuum reading is when you're trying to pass a car or go up a hill. If you're cruising at 14 inches of vacuum and you go to pass a car and it drops down to 10 or 9 or 8, you know to get a power valve that's one step above that. Once you have the opening point of the power valve, you can determine whether the size of the power valve restrictor channels, aka these and these right here, these two right here, if they are too big or too small. Typically, you're going to find out that once you try to pass a car, the power valve opens, but you're still getting hesitation. Power valve channels are too small. If you go to pass a car, power valve opens and your car like slows down, it gets sluggish, power valve channels are too big. Tuning a carburetor is so much easier when you have a wideband and when you have a vacuum gauge readily available. Some people would prefer not to buy that, but for 180 bucks, you can dial in this carburetor in one afternoon and never touch it again until you modify the motor. But for those of us that don't want to spend that money, you're just going to have to use your eyes and ears to get this dialed in. You should be looking at your spark plugs every once in a while. As if you know what lean feels like, you're going to be able to dial it in without pulling your spark plugs. The only reason you're going to want to pull your spark plugs is to make sure that your intake manifold is giving you the right distribution at all 8 cylinders. If all 8 cylinders are fine except for one, then you go ahead and look at that one and find out if it's rich or lean. And then you can go ahead and take your carburetor and that corner jet, maybe jet it up or jet it down one size, and then hopefully you can get that back squared away. Even if you were to run a wideband, you're basing it off of one bank or another bank, or if you have a merge collector that has them both together, you're going to be taking the readings off of the entire motor, and that gives you the average. It doesn't give you the whole scope. So every once in a while, looking at your plugs will definitely make sure that you're dialed in. If you're doing wide open throttle pulls, definitely look at your spark plugs, because that one cylinder that's running a little lean could cost you the motor.